Hello, welcome to these MVP days. Welcome to my session Flow Patterns and Good Practice from Dr. Flow. My name is Serge Luca. My friend called me Dr. Flow. I am MVP in two branches, in Office 365 and also in business application, more specifically in Flow. I'm based in Brussels, in Belgium. My company is ShareQL. So there are key flow limitations that you need to be aware of before starting a flow project. Like that, the flow duration is maximum 30 days. Same for the approval. After 30 days, your flow or your approval stops running. So that is sometimes really annoying because sometimes some of your flow should be able to run beyond 1 year, or you don't know exactly when your flow will stop running. You can have very long approval process. So the good news is that I've defined a pattern called a controller pattern that I will describe a little bit later that allows you to go beyond that, beyond these 30 days. Also, maximum 250 action in a flow. If you want more, you have to split your flow in nested flow, small flows. I also call them service flow because this flow that can be invoked by other flow are also REST services. So, and that can be very, very convenient. Loops, there are maximum 5,000 iteration in a do until, maximum 5,000 iteration in a for each. If you want more, you can buy plan one that will give you 100,000. Also, there's no custom task form. So today, the task form are approval form. So someone can be asked to approve or reject something. You click on the approval, you go to the approval center, there is a tile, and then you get a button approve or a button reject or reassign, and that's it. Sometimes we want to do something different. We want to say it's okay, or I've done this, or I haven't done this yet, or I want to display some business data in the form. So I want to be able to customize the tasks form. So today that's not possible, but I'm pretty sure the Flow team will provide it in the future. But that is important. Also, there's no guest access. That means that you guest user, so user who don't have a Flow license, won't be able to interact with your Flow. And that can be a problem because sometimes you have Flow that can be started from a button, so button flow, or flow that can be run from a SharePoint list or visually. You can run the flow visually from the flow menu in the SharePoint list. So this won't be possible in Flow with guests. Also, there's no flow provisioning in SharePoint site. That means when you provision a site, a SharePoint site, you might expect some flow to already be running and associated with your SharePoint list or SharePoint document library. So there's no easy way to achieve that in Flow. And the last one, there's no state machine. In the next slide, I will explain what a state machine is. But the good news is the controller pattern that I mentioned before can also be used to implement a state machine. So why do we need a state machine? What is a state machine? Let me take an example. We have a user that publish an important document, a legal document in an intranet. When the document is published, then we have a group of people called advisors who will validate the content. If the content is validated, then a group of users called secretariat will validate the style. And then we have the big boss that can validate the final document. And of course, these people might not validate it, so they might reject it. So boss can reject, secretariat can reject, advisor can reject. So that means you need to go to previous situation. And that's something which is not easy to implement in Flow. Because the boss can also redirect to any other states, like advisor, for instance, or to secretariat, right? So last year, I did publish a state machine pattern based on a loop and a goTo variable. This pattern was very easy to implement. But the thing is, it does not allow your flow to run beyond 30 days. So today I will show you a pattern that fixes both 30 days and the state machine implementation and much, much, much more. So let's take a look at this pattern. I call that the controller pattern. So we start your flow. We create a normal flow. Let's call that the launcher flow here. You see it's in red. And then this launcher flow will start a service flow, a nested flow, that will manage all approval. I call that the approval controller. That's why I call this pattern the controller pattern, the flow controller pattern. And basically, this flow will start nested flow that will manage the approval. So every approval for every level, so let's say level 1 is, for instance, the advisor, level 2 is secretariat, level 3 is the boss, for instance. So each approval level has to be implemented in dedicated flow. So we have level 1 approval flow, and what each approval flow will say is it will analyze the return value of the approval and will send the information back to the controller. And the kind of information the approval flow can return to the controller are, oh, I did timeout, oh, the approval is approved, or the approval is rejected, or I want to escalate the approval to someone else. And then the level 1 approval flow stops running, of course. So this information is sent to the approval controller. The approval controller checks this information and restart another flow if necessary. It could be that, for instance, if level 1 ran into timeout, then approval controller will restart level 1. So the previous approval implemented in the level 1 approval will be deleted because there is timeout. When there is a timeout in approval, it's get deleted, and new one will be created automatically. So this is very, very flexible, very, very powerful. So for instance, let's say in level 1, the user did approve. Then approval controller will start a level 2 approval, which can return the same kind of information, or even more, right? Then if the user in level 2 approve, then approval controller will start another flow, level 3 approval flow, etc., etc. Okay, so here, so each level approval flow cannot go beyond 30 days. If they try to go beyond, then they will go into timeout and a new one will be recreated. So this kind of approval system, or this kind of a flow or composite flow, whatever you call it, can run beyond several years actually, right? So I think that's very powerful. Now let's take a look at one example of implementation of this controller pattern, because there's different way to implement that. But I think the one I will show you will probably help you in your project. So let's switch to the flow environment. And this is typically what an approval flow looks like. So it must start with when a HTTP request is received. That means it's a service flow. Of course, you have your approval, and then we have two situations. The first one is, of course, your approval terminate correctly. That means, in this case, you need to talk to the controller, and then you need to say, hey, I'm level 2, so that's the from, I'm level 2, and my response is and the approval output, right? Or you are running in timeout. Indeed, in the approval, you can specify how long you want to approve, or the maximum duration for your approval. So 29 days in this case. So 1 day less than 30 days. And if you are running into timeout, or just before running timeout, you will call the controller and you'll say, hey, I'm level 2 and I did timeout. Do what you have to do. So as simple as that. So we want to keep it simple. But of course, the logic is in the controller. So is the controller. It's a service flow. It can receive two parameters, from and result. And basically, we have a big switch. So in the switch, we are going to analyze who is sending a message. So that's the from parameter. And you can get a message from level 1, from level 2, from level 3, or if you don't get any message, that means you want to start the approval. So in this case, then you're going to call level 1. So you're going to start the flow level 1. And now let's take a look at what's happened in this case flow level 2. So in this case flow level 2, we are going to analyze the return, the result message, right? So there will be another switch. So let's take a look at this one. So we check the result, and the result could be timeout, escalate, approve, reject. So let's take a look at approve. For instance, if it's approved, then this means you're going to say, hey, I'm going to flow level 3. If it's reject, oh, I'm going back to flow level 1. But it can also be escalate, and you will escalate the flow to the big bus, for instance. And of course, escalation can timeout, and then you will get back to the controller. If it's a timeout, for instance, if level 2 say, hey, I'm in timeout, I'm 29 days, then you will start level 2. As simple as that. I mean, there's no complication. It's very, very simple, very, very robust. So basically, we have one flow, or at least one flow, for each branch here. You see? So that's very, very simple, I think. Now let's take a look at how to manage errors. That's something else. And typically what I do for managing errors is this. Let's switch to the flow environment. So this is one of my flow, and all my flow looks the same. That means day code is in a scope called main. And of course you might have other scope in the main scope, subscope if you want. But I manage error at a high level. That means I have a fail scope, I have a timeout scope, I have a succeed scope. And you can specify how you want to get into this scope. For instance, the fail one will run if the main one has failed or is skipped. Timeout will run in the configure run after if the main run into timeout. And of course, succeed will run if there's no error in the main scope, right? So that's very, very important. So you need to manage error because error happen. And typically, for instance, what should you do when your flow fail? Well, there are different ways to react, but some of my customers create a ticket. So for instance, you can use an ITSM tool called ServiceNow. Okay, and you can create a record in ServiceNow, or you can call a supervisor, or do what you want. But managing errors is super important. Now let's take a look at the parallelism pattern, which is an important one. Let's take a look at this. So if you want to work with approval, sometime you want to implement reminder. So if this is one of my flow, I have a scope here where I ask someone to approve. Well, you can say after 25 days, I want people to get a reminder. So to do so, you can create a parallel block with a scope, for instance, where you will implement a do until you reach 25 days. So every day you will count the number of days. And then if you reach, for instance, 25, then you will alert the supervisor, right? So here you check if you are reaching 25 days. And of course, you must check that the approval is not done, right? So then you send an alert. So this is also an important pattern. But there's another one, which is parallelism in the loop. This is a very simple flow that copy items from one SharePoint list to another one. Okay, so we grab items from a SharePoint list, and then we have an apply to each, and we recreate the item in another list. But copying 50 items from one list to the other takes something like 40 seconds, right, by default. And the reason is you copy sequentially, one item after each one. There is a settings that not many people know in the apply to each, which is this one, concurrency control. You can say, hey, I want to work in parallel and I want to go up to 50 threads in parallel. That means your system can copy 50 SharePoint items in this specific case in parallel at the same time. So instead of taking 40 seconds, this flow takes 4 or 5 seconds. Of course, use that when it makes sense. In some situation, you need to work sequentially, so it does not make sense, right? But this one is very, very important. So now let's say you did implement concurrency in your loop. What will happen, or what might happen? You get throttle. So throttling means the service you communicated with says that you are working too fast. In the case of Flow, you won't get throttled directly by the backend service, but you will get throttled by the connector. So most connector implement throttling, and you can get the throttling value in the connector definition or the connector documentation. So example, the SharePoint connector throttle after 600 calls per minute, right? And the good news is that we can manage that. Actually, when you get throttle, that means you get the error HTTP 429. I'm too busy, come later, right? So how can we manage that? So we can, for every action, set up the retry policy. There is a retry policy. If you get HTTP error 429, the action will restart by itself. And sometimes it's not, the default policy is not enough. So if you go to the action settings, you will see retry policy. By default, it's exponential. That means, for instance, if I remember well, if you try 4 times, the first time it will be after 5 seconds, and then 25, and then 25 by 25, etc. So that's exponential. So you can change these settings. You can say, hey, I want you to try 10 times, interval should be 20 seconds, maximum interval should be 1 hour, minimal interval will be 10 seconds, and so on. Okay, so you can mitigate that. And of course, throttling usually does not happen in test or in development. It happens in production. So you have to carefully test your flow before moving that to production. So be ready to change, to apply the retry policy. If the retry policy is not enough, then you can work at the level of the flow itself. That means you can reduce the concurrency control. So for instance, here you can specify that you want only maximum 25 flow to start, right? So if you have more than 25, the flow that try to start will be in pending state. Of course, less flow means less communication with the backend. Another pattern, the long duration pattern. What is that? Actually, you might have noticed that when Flow called an external system, it timeouts after 120 seconds, so 2 minutes. Okay, so you call an API and then it takes a while, and then your flow runs timeout, which is really annoying. And there's a good news, because you can handle that. Basically, most systems can run in long time because we have the concept of HTTP 202. So this backend system that can take a while to run or to complete your request will return an HTTP status, the 202, which is well known, meaning that the request has been accepted for processing, but the processing has not been completed. I'm working on it, and when it will be done, I will return the value, right? So we can handle that in Flow. That's very easy. We can go up to 30 days, by the way, or even more if we implement the controller pattern. And the idea is that you need to use the HTTP webhook action. So internally, a webhook will be created. You didn't even have to know what a big webhook is, because it's automatic. It's completely hidden. So let's take a look at that. This is my flow, very basic. I started manually, and then I call an external system. And instead of using the HTTP action, I'm calling the HTTP webhook. And it's actually very easy. I'm calling the external system, so I'm passing here the URL, the subscribe method, which is in this case is post, and also I'm passing a pointer to myself. So in Flow, we can use the following expression, which is list callback URL. Basically, this return a pointer to yourself, right? It's for the webhook. So you can pass this as a parameter to the calling system. And let's take a look at the calling system. Of course, you can pass more parameters. And actually, I didn't implement a calling system from scratch. What I did is I did create a long-running flow from scratch. So this is my long-running flow when HTTP request is received. And what I'm going to do here is I'm gonna store the callback URL. Okay, because if you remember here, we did pass this, right, as a callback URL. So here in the calling system, I will grab this callback URL parameter and I will store it in a variable. And then I will do what I have to do. It could be proceeding to an approval or running a bot that will talk to a customer or whatever you want. In this case, I simulate a 1 hour activity. And when I'm done, then I will call the calling system back. So I'm going to use the HTTP action, and in the URI, I will just specify the callback store here. I can even pass parameters back to the caller, right? And this works very well. It works up to 30 days. So it's very cool. Now let's take a look at the trigger agnostic pattern. What is that? So to illustrate that, I will show you an example. This is a SharePoint list where I manage expenses, and when I create a new expense, then a flow will automatically start and the expense will go through an approval process. But user can also run a flow from an existing expense. So they can say, I'm selecting this expense and go to the flow menu and I run the expense approval. Or even better, user can directly invoke the flow from within the list here. That is much more intuitive, right? So you can do that. Or even better, you can run a flow from Excel. So for instance, here, these are my data coming from my SharePoint list. I can say, hey, I want to run a flow on this value. So you just select this in your table. You get this because there is a flow add-in in the Excel rich client and in the Excel web. So you just click on this, run, and the flow will run against this value. So the consequence of this is that you will need several triggers in your flow because you can start your flow from Excel, you can start a flow from SharePoint, you can start a flow maybe from an expense application, you can start a flow from an existing application, an existing expense, right? So for each situation, you might need one trigger because flow can only start from one trigger, right? So you cannot have several triggers that start your flow. So you might need the trigger Excel for a selected row. You can need the trigger SharePoint for a selected row if you run the flow directly from the list. Or if you run the flow when an expense is created from an application, for instance, or from a SharePoint list, then you might need the following trigger, SharePoint when an item is created, etc., etc. So that means that you might have to create several small flows. And these small flows will run your main flow. And that's why your main flow might have to start with the when HTTP request is received. This is a very common pattern, right? So I call this small flow, I call them proxy flows, and this one I call that a service flow. Let's quickly move to the conclusion. You will often use flow and Power Apps together. And my advice here is keep your Power Apps forms simple and put the business logic in flow. Also, I've noticed that people use trigger property across the flow. The problem with that is if for any reason you need to change a property, you won't be able to do so. So my advice is store the trigger property in variable or in compose, and then changing the trigger will be easier. Regarding accounts, anytime I create a flow, an enterprise flow, I define a Azure Active Directory group for the owners. And for the connectors, I use service accounts. So I use a dedicated Office 365 account. So I pay a dedicated license for this one, just for the Flow service account. Of course, don't do that if you create personal flow. In case of personal flow, you will have to use your Flow account, your own private Flow account. Regarding management, we can manage Flow by using PowerShell or by using the Flow management connector, which is very powerful. Environment, use several environment and use the data loss prevention rules, which prevent the usage of some connectors in some environment. That's also very important in terms of governance. IT Pro, well, IT Pro will be very interested with Flow because Flow can complement PowerShell. Sometimes some long-running action, long-running process are not easy to implement in PowerShell. Flow is much better for that. So IT Pro can use both. IT Pro can also run PowerShell script from Flow. So you can do that by running an Azure Automation Runbook. And this can run in the cloud, so your PowerShell script will be able to run in the cloud or on-prem. For managing Office 365, Flow can be very interesting. Why? Well, because we have a place called the compliance and audit log where many information surface out. And you can associate a webhook with this event. So you can create a webhooks and a Flow webhook in this place. So that, for instance, you can say, if someone start a Power Apps trial, I want a Flow to trigger and I want a Flow to alert the management. So there's a lot to do in this place. And much more, because this is just the beginning of Flow. I wish I had more time to describe more pattern and good practice, but if you want, you can take a look at my Ignite session, which is referenced right here. Thank you very much.